We're focused today on a conversation with the ambassador of Iraq to the United States. And there's hardly been a day in the last decade and a half when Iraq was not in the news. More often than not on the front page, and more often than not above the fold on the front page. And this has been more unfortunate than fortunate if one looks at it from the perspective of human tragedies. But before getting to the dynamics and implications of those realities, we have to acknowledge an indebtedness amongst every one of us in this room to Iraq and its people, and certainly its ancestors. Here is where the world's first known alphabet began to be written, devised, and disseminated. And it's amazing how many thousand years later they are largely, amongst Western languages, nearly the same number of characters in the alphabet from then till now, although the world's characters have changed somewhat. Iraq, too, is the source of the first codification of laws by which people can arrange their affairs and plan and predict and anticipate with the prospects of an effective civil system of justice. And if Herodotus was correct in saying with regard to Egypt, that Egypt is the gift of the Nile, so too could one say that Iraq is the gift of the Dijla, Furat, of the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And likewise, along with that, the world's first human settlements. And a close cousin of that, the earliest of urban challenges for planning and administration and development, and even human resource investment. Iraq is all of these things in addition to what it has become increasingly in the last decade and a half. But today marks the anniversary of the Articles of Capitulation of Surrender in World War II on the Western Front. So emblematically, symbolically, today is a day of no small moment. But since the American-led invasion of Iraq and its subsequent occupation, to say that Iraq has changed profoundly, domestically and externally, would be a profound understatement. Here is a situation where the population then was 24 million, and as a direct result of that invasion, some 4 million people became uprooted, traumatized, and made refugees. Roughly 2 million external and 2 million domestically displaced internally. That's 1/6 of Iraq's population. To grasp the analogical dynamics of this, and one ponders the American population of 317 or 318 million people, this would mean some 50 million Americans were made refugees as a result of a foreign-led invasion and occupation of a country that had not attacked the country that led that foreign invasion and occupation. We have an exactitude in terms of the numbers of Americans killed in action, and likewise the number of Americans wounded and maimed, scarred for life as a direct result of that invasion. What we do not have is a remote consensus on the number of Iraqis killed as a result of that invasion. And the lack of clarity and certitude on this has its own implications From afar, it looks as though the American people and its spokespeople are self-serving, self-centric, looking out for number one. It was the same in Vietnam. All Americans, for the most part, know that 58,000 Americans were killed there, and their names are enshrined on plaques on the National Mall. Few are aware that a minimum of 1.3 million Vietnamese were killed during the American presence there. And likewise, the figures in terms of numbers of Iraqis killed, for which we might ask the ambassador to guide us to a more responsible bracket range of numbers, has been from a high, seemingly astronomically elevated number of 600,000, written by the most prestigious, prominent British medical journal, The Lancet, barely 2 years after the invasion was launched. And that figure was 600,000. At the Brookings Institution, there is a website that you can refer to called Iraq Body Count. And there the numbers are pushing, if not having exceeded 100,000. So the spread is enormous, as are the implications. And then looking also as a type of graphical error are the numbers of Iraqis that the United States government has allowed into the United States. Syria alone took 1.3 million Iraqis in the opening months of the occupation. And yet as late as 3 years after the American-led invasion, the number of Iraqis allowed into the United States were fewer than 30,000. Syria's population was about 22 million. So it took roughly 1/20th into its borders without any compensation. We, with their more than 300 million, took in fewer than 30,000. If one thinks or concludes that something's missing and wrong with that picture, it's because humanistically something is missing and wrong with that picture. We're talking about the translators, the drivers, the interrogators, the facilitators, each and every one of whom in joining the forces that invaded their country, and some emotionally but not far off the mark factually would say, we killed a country, or themselves with bullseyes on their front and their back as such. However, in the process, the United States ended Iraq's national sovereignty, its political independence, its territorial integrity, the three criteria for admission into and maintenance of one's status in the United Nations. Ponder whether it was worth it in the sense of toppling a dictator. And if one says yes, it was worth it, ponder the implications of that with regard to other dictators in the world. The relationship is still a privileged and prominent and prestigious one between Iraq and the United States. Just in recent days, the first F-16 fighter aircraft from Lockheed Martin came to Iraq, and therefore at least it's en route to regaining its national sovereignty over its airspace. There have been more recent reports, perhaps, of the United States assisting the Iraqi government through the provision of drone aircraft to try to get on top of the internal security challenges. But here is also a place where the United States promised much to the American people and to the Iraqi people with regard to such American valued notions as democratization, civil society, human rights, civil rights, gender rights, and the like. And yet the record has been spotty. We told during the Cold War those in Hungary, all you need to do is rise up. We'll be with you. They did rise up. We were not with the Hungarians. The Soviet tanks rolled in and their uprising was crushed. We said the same thing to the Czechoslovakians in 1968, and they did rise up, and we set not one boot on the ground. And we said the same yet again in Iraq after the liberation of Kuwait in late February 1991. And the southern Iraqis did rise up, and yet we did nothing. So this relationship is not all positive. It's troubled at the seams. Some would say it's troubled at the center. We have the ambassador to enlighten us on his view of this country and its opportunities and challenges, and its relationship with the United States and its other allies, friends, and working partners. He comes to this task like many Iraqi leaders, having previously been in exile for fully 2 decades, especially amongst the Iraqi exiles in London, during which time he obtained his advanced education, undergraduate at the University of Manchester, and then increasingly focusing on business and technology issues, especially in the field of communications. He's been posted here to Washington not very long, but he's been welcomed during the time he's here, as he is today. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Lukman Faily.
Dr. Anthony, Your Highness, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for providing me with such an opportunity with a platform at a very prestigious place. I think Patrick called Dr. Anthony, he called him the Wikipedia. I would more or less call him the Oracle. I also would like to thank the National Council for U.S. Arab Relations, which is doing a great job at improving the American knowledge and understanding of the Arab world. And I'm proud to be here today. Before I say more, I would like to thank the American people for helping the Iraqi people to free ourselves from dictatorship. Dr. Anthony talked about the historical perspective. He talked about what I might call the formation of the pretext to the formation of the Second Republic, which Iraq is undertaking now. Iraq has had a tremendous rich history. However, the recent development, mainly at the second part of the 20th century, has been one of pure dictatorship and pure government focused on militarizing the whole society, in which for the last 35 years, 3 decades of that was primarily in wars and civil wars and using its most ruthless weapons, Scud missiles and others, chemical weapons and others against his own people, let alone against our own neighbors, such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and others. So we start with somewhat a bad legacy to start a government, to start a new society based on a new paradigm of looking into becoming a healthy member of the global community. There has been debate about whether Iraq was worth American blood and treasure, including the sacrifice of too many of your sons and daughters. All I can say is that the Iraqi people and our neighbors throughout the region suffered terribly from Saddam's regime during the decades of terror. For all the challenges that we face, Iraq is better placed today than we were 11 years ago. And I will talk about that more, and I hope that Q&A will be challenging enough for me to talk about some of the taboo areas which Anthony tried to mention. The topic of today's discussions, Iraq update, challenges and opportunities, couldn't be more timely. Only 9 days ago, on April 30th, 60% of the Iraqis, which is about 21.5 million eligible voters, participate in a parliamentary election at 8,075 polling centers across Iraq. This was the fourth national election since the overthrow of Saddam and the first since the withdrawal of American troops in late 2011. The vote counts continues to be underway, and the final results will expected to be released by the end of this month. This election makes a milestone in Iraq's journey from despotism to democracy, and the international community is recognizing the progress we are making under very difficult circumstances. And I think Dr. Antin mentioned some of those circumstances. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Special Representative for Iraq, said in his election, this election was, and I quote, the first entirely Iraqi-owned process in which the United Nations had an advisory role, but the leading role was with the Iraqi authorities. He added, and again I quote him, that the Iraqis deserve a lot of credit for the very professional way in which they approached the organizations of the election. Despite the terrorist tactics to intimidate Iraqis and disturb the voting, we did everything we could to ensure that the election was free, fair, and transparent. Iraqis chose among more than 9,000 candidates from 107 political entities, competing for 323 parliamentary seats. 9,000 for 300 seats. So you can imagine the numbers. Roughly 30 persons per seat. Our electoral process encouraged an inclusive government. More than 2,600 women were on the ballot. 25% of the seats were allocated to women. That's by the Constitution. And other seats are reserved for Christians and other religious and ethnic minorities. We took strong steps to ensure the accountability and transparency of this process. For the first time, Iraqis used the electronic voting card system. This system significantly minimized electoral fraud, and it ensured that all voters are clearly informed about their polling stations in advance. Transparency means that we want observers to watch what we are doing. There was more than 650 foreign observers, including representatives from foreign missions and Arab League. There were 37,500 Iraqi observers, mainly representing political parties. More than four for every polling stations. These Iraqi observers came from both political parties and local NGOs and national NGOs. In addition, there were 278 accredited foreign media and 1,915 accredited Iraqi journalists. There was strong security on election day. In fact, with all the trouble you hear on the news, there was not a single security incident in Baghdad on that day. Special agreements were made to allow internal displaced people to vote in the several provinces across Iraq. For Iraqi diaspora, there was out-of-country voting in 19 nations across the world. Here in the United States, there were polling stations in Illinois, California, Michigan, Texas, Arizona, Virginia, and Tennessee. While the ballots are still being counted, we know that every vote that was cast was a strong vote against the violent extremists. These terrorists were trying to frighten Iraqis from the polling places in order to keep democracy from taking hold in our country. As the 60% turnout reveals, the terrorists failed, but the fight continues. I'm sure you are all aware of the ongoing battle against Al-Qaeda and their affiliates in the Anbar province. The threat we face are part of the larger struggle. The terrorism we face is transnational in nature. Iraq again is the front line for this fight. We are the front line for this fight. and we have been there for some time now, the front line. It threatens our neighbors in the Middle East and North Africa directly, and ultimately it endangers the US and entire world's community security. We are well aware of that purely military approach will not succeed in stopping terrorism, nor will it succeed in healing the sectarian, ethnic, and regional rift that the violent extremists exploit. This challenge requires a comprehensive strategy, including outreach and open, inclusive policies. We are striving to build a democracy where everyone has a voice. Because Al-Qaeda is targeting all Iraqis, whether that's Sunnis, Shiites, Arabs, Turkmen, or Kurds, among other groups, we are seeking to unite all Iraqis against Al-Qaeda. As a result of our outreach efforts, many tribes in Anbar have been fighting alongside the security forces in Ramadi, Fallujah, and elsewhere. Yes, as Secretary of State John Kerry stated, this is Iraq's fight, and we accept that challenge. But make no mistake, we will win this fight because of our tenaciousness, because of our unquestionable determination to avoid a return to tyranny. Here, let me be clear. Iraqis do not seek US boots on the ground. We want to work within the strategic framework agreement which was signed between our two countries prior to the troop withdrawal, to bolster our joint efforts to defeat our common enemy, Al-Qaeda and their offshoots. Iraq and the United States have defeated Al-Qaeda before. We can do it again. Our blood is mixed together on Iraqi soil. We have been paying heavy price for this fight. We will not shy away from it again. And we will defeat Al-Qaeda again, as we did in the past. We will work with the tribes and the local citizens who help to protect their own community, and we will pursue the terrorist networks with sound intelligence and capable forces. The partnership between Iraq and the United States is based more than just military cooperation. On the strategic front, Iraq wants to share information about the terrorist threats and to better coordinate our efforts against it, with the United States, I might add, and with the regional players, and we're doing that. On the diplomatic front, our partnership is developing into what President Obama described as a normal relationship based on mutual interest and mutual respect. Iraq and our Iraqis and our government value the opinion of our American friends. Your government makes decisions based on Americans' best interest, just as we make decisions based on our own interest. Most of the time, our goals converge. Sometimes they may diverge. There are occasions when the positions of our government may appear to you to resemble that of your American or to that of Americans' antagonists in the region. But when that happens, you should rest assured that our reasons are distinctly different than those of your adversaries. For instance, on Syria, Iraq has been criticized for not joining the United States and others in seeking to remove Bashar al-Assad from power. As a result, some have unfairly lumped us with the supporters of al-Assad, having suffered under the Ba'athist regime led by Saddam. We understand and know that the Ba'athist regime led by Assad is not a friend of Iraq. Terrorists have used Syria as a base for targeting Iraqis for a decade now. In 2009, we lodged complaints against the Syrian regime at the UN, but many countries stood against us and protected Assad from doing so. And mainly this was at the Security Council level. Now times have changed, and some accuse us of waiting to perpetuate Assad in power, wanting to perpetuate Assad in power. This is simply not true. We are not opposed to political change in Syria. On the contrary, but we are opposed to using destructive methods to bring about that change. Further militarization of this conflict in Syria can only lead to a spread of violence and extremism, which unfortunately has already spilled over its neighboring regions or its neighboring countries. Our Syrian brothers have suffered enough. If change in Syria will mean that Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups control large swathes of the country, then we oppose that kind of change. We oppose that kind of change. We seek a better future, a negotiated settlement, and a free chosen government of national unity, with the participation of all social sectors and an end to the bloodshed. We strive for a good relations with all the countries, especially our neighbors. Naturally, we have strong relationships with some of our neighbors than others. But without exception, we have extended a hand of friendship to all of our countries in the region. We have made great strides in mending our relationship with Kuwait. This resulted in the lifting of UN sanctions, and we are continuing to pursue dialogue in order to resolve any outstanding differences with other countries in the region. In all our dealings in the region, Iraq has made it clear that we oppose the introduction of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. If any country acquires nuclear weapons, it will immediately threaten regional security and stability. We strongly support moving the Middle East toward becoming a nuclear weapon-free zone. Last year, Iraq ratified the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. We hope other countries will ratify it as well. And we are pleased that America and Iran are both serious about a negotiated solutions to overcome differences, for the sake of our region and for the sake of the world. This will certainly lead to the reduction of tension in already volatile part of the world. In Iraq, we do not shy away from our challenges. We acknowledge that the road ahead is filled with obstacles. We need to put an end to the surge of terrorism that continues to threaten the safety of our people, and we must strengthen our state institutions in order to effectively combat that corruption that is impending greater development and prosperity for our people. Having come so far, we are determined to set the country on the path towards democracy, development, stability, and ultimately social harmony. This is why on the economic front, we seek a stronger partnership with the United States based on investments and trade, not charity or aid. Iraq has one of the world's fastest growing economies, expanding by 9.6 in 2011 and 10.5 in 2012. Our oil production has increased by 50% since 2005. We are expected to emerge as the world's second largest energy exporter by 2030. This has been a critical factor in keeping global energy markets stable despite increased sanctions on Iran. We are investing our energy revenues in rebuilding our infrastructure, diversifying our economy, restoring our electricity, and reviving our education and healthcare systems. As we rebuild, Iraqis can be a promising partner for American companies in various fields. As an IT professional myself, I would add that Iraq offers great opportunities for companies in information technology, telecommunication, and other industries, where America, and primarily Silicon Valley, leads the world. Iraq recently announced plans to auction 3G telecommunication licenses, and we are keen to see America's companies work under this market. As some of you might be here, only 2 weeks ago, I ran the Boston Marathon. in honor and in support of the victims of terrorism from Boston to Baghdad. And before you say that, yes, I'm still alive and I didn't complete the war. From the fight against terrorism to the work of rebuilding our own country, many of our endeavors seem at last as long as hard as running a marathon. We want to run that race alongside our American friends. Together, we can climb heartbreak hills and reach the finish line of a prosperous and democratic Iraq, a more stable Middle East, and a world with less to fear from terrorism. Let me thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today, and I will be looking forward for your Q&A. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, in keeping with protocol of past events, we'd ask if you do have questions for His Excellency, if you would kindly, there are note cards and there are pens actually in those packets with some legal pads for you to take back and information about Wilfred Farah Gelder. I'm not doing a commercial.
Do you mind if
Sure, no, that's wonderful. So, Mr. Ambassador, I will. So, anyways, questions on note cards. That's what I'm trying to convey. So, just raise your hand if you have a question for the ambassador, and the National Council's wonderful staff will collect them. Check.
Mr. Ambassador, you've generated quite a few questions here. I will try to group some of them together to avoid repetition or overlap as such. How likely is it that the Kurdish regions will remain autonomous in the long term? And what are the implications of what happens to Kurdistan in any event for Syria, for Iran, and for Turkey, in particular Turkey?
As you fully aware, the Kurdish question, the decision, the aspirations of the Kurds have always been an outstanding question in the region. Iraq is one of those parts of the region. However, in relation to that, over the last, actually during the 20th century, Iraqi part of the Kurdistan was a freer, more able, I would say even prosperous part of the whole Kurdish entities across the whole region. Kurds say that they are the largest stateless entity or nation in the world. What population, 30, 40 million, I don't know. However, within the Iraqi part of that, they've had autonomous agreements, they've had able to talk their language, education, all kinds of cultural events, political positions in the government, and so on. So, in a way, they had an easier ride on the Iraqi side. That's the right word to use. And as the as to the straight after the Gulf War, a safe haven was created with international protection, primarily from the NATO and the Americans, and therefore created a status quo in Iraq prior to the 2003 American invasion. When the new Iraq was formed in 2003, a status quo already existed of a KRG, Kurdish Regional Government, with their parliament, elections, and self-governing. We had to deal with the reality. A new federal political system was put in place, a new constitution which was ratified by the Kurds and others, which said that we have a federal setup. 3 provinces are part of that federal setup, and KRG, Kurdish Region Government, became part of the new Iraq. That's the realities of the situation. How will it evolve? It will evolve more or less as how best we can work with each other how could we define and appreciate the new Iraq, provide a venue for others to express their views, and obviously the regional geopolitics becomes a crucial factor in that as well. The situation in Syria has not helped. More than 220,000 refugees from the Syrian Kurds are in Iraq. So they've already had an incursion of a type into the Iraqi situation. And obviously the Kurdish element in Turkey is evolving, let alone on the Iranian side. I would say that the story is still not told. The full story is still revolving or evolving. And I would say that the current Kurdish discourse in Iraq is to be a healthy partner to the rest of Iraq. And we are working based on that formula.
Mr. Ambassador, this one has to do with an aspect of the Kurdish question. Article 140 of the Constitution addresses the issue of general relations with the Kurdistan region about Kirkuk and its environment. What will happen there, since Article 140 was supposed to have been implemented a few years after voting the Constitution into effect in 2005? Here we are, 9 years later, when it appears yet to be implemented.
What we have in Iraq, and this was, I think, 2007 should have been completed, if I remember my memory is certain right. What we have here is still an evolving picture. A concept of closure, which is crucial to the American mindset and way of operating, I would say it's somewhat weak in Iraq. And it's not a concept in relation to 140. I can give you a long list of other issues in which we have not yet been able to do a proper closure on it. And that's to do with the culture, it's to do with how important time is, it's to do with what are the other priorities and how long thought people are versus short-termisms versus urgency of issues. Article 140 is one of those items. I'm sure that the political discussions in the next government will try to reflect back on Article 140. How do we go about the demographic issue changes in the Kirkuk? The national census has not taken place, and Article 40 is an integral part or directly related to that. Until we have a better demographic understanding of the evolving pictures in Kirkuk, for the last, we have to understand that this is primarily based on 1957 census versus 2003 post situation, in which a major demographic changes took place in the Kirkuk, where there was historically predominantly Kurds, Turkmens were there as well, and now there are Arabs, and there is a bit of disputed territories, as was might be called. And that is still evolving. I don't think Kirkuk is any unique in comparison to the others. The Kurds appreciate the change in the demography. We also have to have a certain element of closure. That will not take place now until the census is complete and until this article becomes part of the resolution of the new formation of the government.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. That relates to another question that had to do with Americans failing to achieve closure or even entrance on some of its legally obligatory dynamics. Article 6 of the United States Constitution says that all international laws, conventions, and treaties to which the United States is a sovereign signatory are the supreme law of the land. And yet the United States, a leader in the passage of the Fourth Geneva Conventions regarding the prohibitions on occupying powers from expropriating the occupied people's territories,
That's all said and written by a lawyer, I guess.
remains to be implemented at all by the United States. So this was just an overlap with yours there. Why is the legalization of commercial and legal documents at your embassy so, quote, slow and tedious? Many business representatives are always complaining about the delays.
What we have in Iraq is an extremely old bureaucratic systems process of governing. There hasn't been a significant change in the actual processes, primarily after 2003. However, there has been a significant change in the culture to create for customer service and accountability and so on. What you have is people aspirations has been raised, but yet the dynamics of the government to change the legislations for the parliament to effectively change the myriad of, I would say, old legislations which are primarily related more to the police state, that's still outstanding. And this part of the, this has led to delay in certain development. Let me give you an example. This is all related to the investment aspect of it as well. We were able to draw various laws encouraging investment, but we still have to align that with old laws as well. And when a conflict takes place, we need to, I would say, do better our houseworks on that. That's part of it. The embassy itself has strived to provide the best service in visa and others. As far as accreditation to these documents, this is part of the legacy which we are working hard on, but it's still not fully addressed. More so from a timeline.
This next question has to do with your relations with Saudi Arabia. It is known that there are divergences, tensions, and disagreements between the governments in Baghdad and Riyadh. So how do you see relations moving forward with Saudi Arabia, and how would you react to the idea of there being a natural convergence between Iraq's interest in defeating al-Qaeda with the interest of the leadership of Saudi Arabia wanting also to defeat al-Qaeda? We haven't seen this kind of cooperation between the two governments. If it exists, would you please enlighten us? If it does not exist, would you please comment as to why and what the prospects are?
Saddam left us with a long list of legacies of distrust between Iraq and its neighbors. Invasion of Saudi Arabia, invasion of Kuwait, issues with Iran, certainly the invasion of Iran, the issues with Turkey, and so on. So we already, let alone the Syrian situation. They were both Ba'athist party, both forming, they had a united country in historically supposed theories, but they were adversaries as well with Syria. So let alone others. So those who were on the same ideological page couldn't get along with, let alone others as well. So unfortunately, that legacy, we're still suffering from it. We are yet to establish, I would say, a strong common vision, common approach, common understanding with all our neighbors. The relationship with majority of our neighbors has significantly improved. We've tried to normalize and move into a partnership with the majority of our neighbors. We were able to do that with Kuwait, Iran, Turkey. We have challenges with working with that. With Jordan, we have the strategic pipeline working on as well. Syria, we have challenges, and Saudi Arabia. With the Saudi Arabia, we have reached out with our representation at the ambassadorial level. We have had an ambassador there at, I think, 2009, if I remember correctly. My predecessor, Japan, moved on to that. And we are awaiting for full representation of Saudi Arabia at a residential ambassadorial level. They have a non-residents based in Jordan. I think it's part of the legacy. We are yet to clear up all those legacy issues. The sectarian polarization in the region has not helped us. The issue of Iraq being weak and its neighboring, primarily being Turkey and Iran, try to influence that situation hasn't helped us. The relationship with Saudi has been trying to deal with domestic operational issues such as Hajj, such as border issues, such as smuggling between the borders, that sort of things. We've been working on that hard. We've been able to get an arrangement to exchange of prisoners and so on. Yet, if you ask me, do we have I would say a healthy relationship? I would say no. Are we working hard at it? Yes. Are the challenges fundamental? I would say no. We need to have a more embracing of each other's facts and each other's situation. I think based on that, I suspect the relationship can improve significantly and fast.
And this one has 2 or 3 related parts here. How are relations between Kuwait and Iraq over and beyond what you have mentioned in passing thus far, particularly with regard to the status of reparations still due to Kuwait? And related to that, the larger issue of Iraq's relations with the other 5 GCC countries and their consensus, almost a consensus, about Iran's meddling or interference in their domestic affairs being a major issue for them, one that they asked the United States before it began the P5+1 negotiations with Iran, if the GCC countries might at least be in those meetings, if only as auditors and observers. Iran said no, and the United States said okay. That Iran also has interfered in Iraq's domestic affairs, I think, is beyond debate. So Kuwait specifically, because many Iraqis thought for decades that Kuwait should properly be the 19th province of Iraq.
Not many Iraqis. I would dispute that. Saddam used it as an opportunity to expand his leader of the Arab vision, which he wanted to emulate Nasser and others. And the invasion of Kuwait was based on that. He misread the geopolitics of the region and the globe, and we have paid the price for this miscalculation. Part of that price is we had Chapter 7 issues and other. I would say we are at the high list of UN sanctions than any other country in the world, and we more or less have resolved all those issues. Even the Chapter 7 issues, we are out of maybe 53 billion, which was paid to the Saudis, to the Kuwaitis. We've more or less paid around 43 or 44 billion. By the end of next year, we will finish all the repayments of that amount. It already deducts 5% of our revenue even before we start any calculation on that. So the process is improving. The relationship with Kuwait has more or less moved on into a healthy relationship. There are issues of airlines and other outstanding issues already resolved. The representation is at the highest. The trips, the bilateral trips, the traffic flow between the two countries has significantly improved. I would say that it's one of the most successful factors of how Iraq has done a closure on its relationship with Kuwait. And the border signs and everything else, and we're still working on that because of the large list of legacy issues. As far as Iran is concerned, Iraq as a state more or less demolished after 2003. The whole state collapsed with Saddam. He was able, it was like a shell. From 80 to 2003, Saddam started chipping on the state parts for that 23 years. At the 2003, you can only see the shell of the state, with no real content, with corruption, legacies, devaluation of the money by 10,000 times, so you have to just imagine that. To 1980, one Iraqi dinar was $3. 2003, $1, 3,000 dinars. So that was the economical side, let alone demolition or more or less evaporation of the middle class and everything else. We talked about, Dr. Anthony talked about some of the numbers. That's the legacy we wake up, which meant that Iraq was a fragile country with no antibodies to deal with any of the neighbors, let alone with Iran, whom we have a large border. Iran to us is somewhat similar to the Mexico and Canada to you. It's not like the Cuba situation. So we have large borders, we have issues, we have large legacy issues to address in the water streams, the oil wells, and so on. Based on that, we have tried as much as strength as possible to rebuke any pressure from the Iranians. Let me give you one simple example. The strategic framework agreements with the United States, that was not their favorite day that they decided that. And we have other issues. But we have a strategic relationship in relation to religious tourism. We get more than, I would say, a few millions of Iranians come over for religious tourism. That's a revenue we can't do without for our development and economic issues. And at the end of the day, you have to deal with your neighbor. You have to contain it, but at the same time, try to have a healthy relationship. And we're working hard at that. We are not saying that we are 100% healthy in rebuking any of our neighbors. No, we're evolving state, and we'll talk about that another. I'd be more than happy to share the type of challenges we have, which we're working on.
All right, thank you. I think before we leave, yes, we would like to hear you prioritize the challenges. That would be a good note on which to end, but we have some more questions here. And for clarification on the last one, of the $50 billion in reparations, more than 40 billion.
If I remember correctly.
Yes,
Yeah.
and more than 40
43 or 44 we
Yeah.
already paid.
Is this not the government to government versus the private Kuwaiti claims for reparations for damages done to their inventories, homes, livelihoods, which, correct me if I'm wrong, remains an issue in Kuwait's Council of Deputies? That,
As far as I'm aware, there were 3 issues outstanding with the whole Kuwait as an entity. People and government, which was to do with the reparation, which is to do with their archive, and to do with their missing Kuwaiti, not POW, yeah, because they were not prisoners of war, but missing in action sort of things. Or they were. That's every now and then recently, my minister and our foreign services took part of that archive back. And we still have, by the way, the government pays for people who say, if there is still an outstanding Kuwaiti items in your house, please bring it and we'll pay you money. So that's what we're working on. As far as I'm aware, the Kuwaiti issue would be closed by the people because we already opened that up and we went through that painful process. There is still might be a question which is to do with international issues, but we're going through the Paris Club with countries and companies, and we're still working on that.
Move back over to economic related issues.
Can I just say one thing on this issue? You have to imagine a country going through wars which was imposed by the dictator, one of the most ruthless dictators in history, not elected, nothing. Yet the country has been penalized, and we have said, okay, we as a state, we as people will pay for that recklessness of the dictator. And this is what's taking place. Against all the issues we have, we're not technically still not a rich country. We may have a rich revenue coming in, but we still have major challenges in our infrastructure. So that's the extent. And we know that Kuwait doesn't need that money. But we are more than happy. We are more than willing to say we need to get a closure on these issues. They are our brothers, they suffered, we have to get a closure. And that's part of it.
One thing that's making your responses so rich and well received is from our media and Congress and others, talk shows, the absence of context, the absence of background, the absence of perspective. You're providing all 3 of these in the answer to your questions, and we're indebted to you for that and more. How do you see Iraq's oil production, near term, medium term, long term? We have one of our interns, former interns, working for one of the largest oil companies in your country, and therefore we are proud of that. He would not have gone into that field had he not been an intern here, but he's a human bridge between you and us. So Iraq's oil production, you mentioned by 2030 would be the world's second largest in terms of production and exports, or
We-
production at least.
What we are working on, we have a drive by the government to increase our oil production substantially to make up for all the lost ability to build in our structure. Imagine a country not going through the redevelopment or rehabilitation for 3 decades. Since 1980, since the war with Iran started, the government stopped doing any investments, any developments, any new hospitals and so on until 2003. So with the destruction took place after 2003, imagine all that accumulation. We as a government had the determination to increase our capability, to increase our export beyond the current standards, beyond the current OPEC standards and others, because we think that there is a lost opportunity which we need to recap on. We need to revitalize our economy based on that. Rebuilding our infrastructure and so on. And that's where the drive is. Over the last 10 years, if you look at with all the challenges of Iraq, one of the key success factors or examples has been the increase and stabilization, development, and increase in oil production. With all the challenges we have, that's only one of the very few upward graphs in the oil development sector. However, we know that this is not a very labor-intensive industry. It recruits less than 1% of our workforce. So we need to re-energize, regenerate that money into other sectors for our development and for our employment rates to reduce. That's where we're coming from. International agency, International Energy Agency last year did an extensive report in which it gave 3 scenarios. And the middle scenario was something like by 2020 we will be around 26.25 million barrels, and we are on target to achieve that. We have substantially increased our capabilities. International companies from all walks of life and all countries are participating in various licenses that we've done in Iraq, and we're developing that. Iraq is the only country with the capability to substantially increase oil in relation to any other oil country, because we have the wealth, the low percentage of exploration at this moment, and also because of the ability, the quick ability to extract the oil. It doesn't require a lot of investment. It doesn't to extract it in relation to the profit margin I'm talking about. So it's one of those lowest countries in producing. I'm not saying it's lowest, it's one of those lowest. So it's a very incentive capability for companies to work on. We are still working on the production sharing, the service contracts and so on, and we're still evolving that. That's still evolving. However, the key message to take away is the country, as people, as government, as institutions, are determined to substantially increase our production because we need that money to re-energize the economy. That's a demand, that's a need. So that's not a political decision, that's a necessity.
Related to that question, and the claim that by 2030 you'll be number 2, is one that was coming later, having to do with Iran, that Iran would stand a greater chance of becoming number 2 than Iraq for the following 3 reasons. One, unlike Iraq, it has substantial, known, proven offshore reserves along its 550-mile long coast with some 19 ports that can be developed. Iraq is short of fewer than 50 miles, barely a card-carrying Gulf country, and much of its offshore has been silted up as a result of the long Iran-Iraq war. Iran also has the world's second largest gas reserves and still unexplored or untapped or modernized oil reserves, in addition to being the only country in the Middle East that has acreage also on the Caspian Sea, which is also energy rich, leading some to conclude that Iran is the greater strategic prize with regard to energy issues and perhaps developmental issues also.
Where is the question there? Let me put it this way. If I'm an oil energy consumer, this is music to my ear. Two countries are competing for producing more richer oil at faster rate to the global economy via various routes. Talk about it. If I am an Iraqi, I will say that's a good competition to be in. The international demand are there, and we will compete for that. For free market economy, this has its own dynamics, and we're okay with that. As much as the diversity and others as well, I agree there's an issue of the bottleneck of the staff. However, we have been working hard to provide other platforms to increase the capability, to diversify via Jordan, via Turkey. We were in discussions prior to the Syrian situation to revitalize the pipeline we already had with Syria. So we already are thinking about diversifying. We're working on diversifying our export capabilities. Are we in competition with Iran? I hope that we are in partnership in providing a stable source of economy to stabilize the global economy. Oil should not be used as a weapon to destabilize the world. On the contrary, it should be a healthy product used by a country consciously with environmental thoughtfulness put into it, and it should be a tool of bridging countries, not competing and fighting.
This one has to do with the view that Iraq was once the medical capital, most prestigious center for healthcare facilities, medical research, medical care in the region. Today there is the opposite. There's medical flight with doctors and other healthcare professionals leaving the country for care, on top of patients leaving the country for care. So in light of the government's GDP, what is the government's inclination to court U.S. healthcare organizations to assist in rebuilding this fundamental aspect of social reform and dynamics and needs in Iraq? Apropos this last week, that was the first ever Arab-U.S. healthcare summit in New York. Saudi Arabia was prominently featured, to a lesser degree the Emirates. So this is a new sector with great potential for both our countries' people.
We see that sector as also an important sector for the development of U.S.-Iraq relationship. Iraqis have in their recent memory a clear consciousness about how well the country was doing. So we have a good example to try to emulate in our own history, let alone in our neighbors or global partners. So that history is until 1980. And therefore, it's one of the drivers. People say, we were good, we were able to be the cornerstone of the region in relation to education, in relation to healthcare, and social welfare, and so on. In a way, that's a good example for us to try to revitalize. As far as the challenge is concerned, the country is increasing by a population of 1 million every year. It's one of the highest population growth in the world. It's not the highest, but it's one of the highest. Which means that we need to keep up with that throughput of increase by building new hospitals, schools, and other infrastructures. The capability of the people to have the cash flow to need the medical care and therefore go overseas because A, they have the passport, they're able to travel, they have the cash in their pockets. If they're not getting the local services sufficiently, then they are going abroad. And we are encouraging for the healthcare of the people, not for the economical development. We're saying that if people haven't got the facilities at home to do, then let's talk. And our ministries of health is having discussions with India, for example, in Malaysia, neighboring countries, Iran. I think Beirut was one of the centers which we always use that. In addition to Western countries, to say, okay, we need to have partnership because we don't have that services back home. At the same time, we were working in development of new hospitals. We've got quite new hospitals by the Japanese, managed by the Japanese, Germans, and Italians, and Turkish companies. So we're trying to cope up beef up our medical care services. However, the population growth plus their cash ability plus their travel ability means that they may go elsewhere. And we're saying we're okay with that. But we need ourselves to try to have new hospitals so that the local economies and the employments and so on is beefed up.
Can you educate us about Al-Anbar province? A look at the map would suggest that it is nearly 1/3 the size of all of Iraq and bigger than any of the other provinces. And even if the Iraqi military is able to defeat the uprising in Al-Anbar, such a military victory would be temporary, as I think you indicated. There's no military solution to these challenges. What can Iraq do to bring Sunnis more fully into the governance and civil society of the country? And is it not possible that that part of the country could emerge as a de facto Sunni stand within Iraq?
The Sunni stance scenario, people talked about it from early 2004, so it hasn't been new. The representation of at the highest level has taken place for Sunnis, Arab Sunnis, I think, let's be specific, because Kurds are majority Sunni as well, and they are different. So the Arab Sunnis. However, the Anbar situation, the size of it doesn't reflect the population representation. This is primarily desert. Historically, even during the highest capabilities of the Iraqi army, it usually let the tribes and locals manage that province because of the size of it, because of the inhospitality of it, and so on. And it's usually focused on the street or the border strip. That has been usually the gendarmes or border police. That's the historical perspective into it. So it's always had an issue of local control. That's where we came from. The Americans, and with all their capabilities, had difficulties managing that with two harsh chapters during the invasion of Iraq. And therefore we have good perspective and good historical narrative to compare it to. And we are conscious of that. We are also conscious that the Al-Qaeda is trying to utilize their infiltration of cities as a base, and we are also conscious not to barge into these cities and sort of have a gun-ho approach to it. We're conscious of that. We're trying to work with the local police, with the local tribes. Our key partners are those who are elected, by the way, the governor of Anbar, the tribes and others, local authorities. They are elected and they're working with us. We're providing arms, we're providing some capabilities, funds, but we are new as a military institution. We are new. We're just, as we talked about it, we still short of a single fighter plane. So and that's why we're working with our American friends in our F-16 program and our Apache program, whom has been approved by Congress, and we're working on that deliveries and so on. Next month I will go to the graduation of our F-16 pilots. I went to some last August. Now this is the main course. So we are beefing up our capabilities to have a better control and try to contain the situation within Anbar, and certainly try to dislodge it from the Syrian situation, because that's a key challenge. What we have is jihadists from Chechnya to Afghanistan coming to Iraq. And I called it the battlefront. It is a battlefront. That's unfortunate. The Syrian situation has not been addressed. We still can't see the light at the end of that situation, and it's automatically having a direct impact on us through the open border, through the tunneling of monies, funds, and jihadists and so on. So that's a challenge, and that's what we're saying. We're saying what's taking place is an international challenge, not just an Iraqi challenge. In addition to the political situation we talked about.
You mentioned the Ba'ath Party on several occasions there en route to other points, or included in larger points. What is the status of the former Ba'ath Party members in terms of being incorporated into the government, or estimates of how many ran in the most recent elections? And what is the status of the return of property confiscated by the Ba'athists?
We had committees set up in negotiation with Parliament, primarily after the demonstration took place early last year, which was led by the Deputy Prime Minister for Energy, Sheikh Dr. Shahristani. He looked into cases. I think there were about 3,500 or thereabout cases. We tried to expedite some of those who were sort of harshly treated, or who were unjustly treated, or who were not able to go back to their work and so on. However, we also have a legacy of Ba'athists being correlated to the destruction of country. That's what you have to think about. In people's psychology, Ba'athist is very similar to the Nazism element in Germany. Is they led to the destruction of the country, ruthlessly sort of dealing with their locals, let alone with the neighbors of Iraq. That's where the psychological issue is. The key challenge has been for us is to try to get a balance between the stability and peace for the society versus the justice and versus the ability to get a closure for the people who were the victims of the Ba'athists. That's the key challenge. As far as the elections concerned, for example, there were less than 20 people disbarred from putting their names forward as candidates. Less than 20. I talked about 9,000 names, less than 20. So we have, in this election, we have not had any serious discuss as to who should be disbarred, whether they are senior Sunnis or senior Ba'athists, ex-Ba'athists, or some of them still declare their I would say to them it's the nostalgic days of the Ba'athists. They declare that in the media and so on. Although by the Constitution is illegal. The Constitution stipulates the Ba'athists are a Ba'ath party. And that's agreed by the country, by the whole population. So we have an issue of the injustice, the past injustice, versus the might be currently the political sort of stability of the country.
This question perhaps feeds off of that answer, at least in terms of the chances for a coalition government in Iraq if Mr. Maliki now believes that only majority rule works, which would seem to leave open the possibility, if not the probability, of one of his current allies simply leaving the state of law coalition. The reference here is to, I think, Ayad Alawi and his followers, and an echo of the American situation where in 2000, in the United States, the person who got the most votes lost. Could you address that, along with what has happened to Muqtada as-Sadr, who was once quite a controversial figure, and the role of Ali Sistani? Many in the audience, not being specialists on Iraq, would benefit from your educating us on each of those.
I'm here humbly to tell you how to educate. The country is still evolving in who has the moral, political authority. And the role of Marja'iyah, the role of Najaf, has been primarily to work with the government and to project some harmony, to project some stability, to project some maturity of the government in providing services and others. Grand Ayatollah Sistani has led that campaign, and for example, during the peak of the civil war, it was the primary factor which positively tilted towards stabilizing the country by saying you should not be indiscriminate in your revenge, you should let the state handle these issues and so on. So he has been one of the heroes of Iraq over the last 10 years. People have seriously talked about him getting a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, and I think he's worthy of that because of his positive role in the stabilizing, harmonizing, developing Iraq, and that's a testament to his, I would say, the humility and his testament to his ability to have that big heart. Bearing in mind, he's not even an Iraqi nationalist. He doesn't even vote. He doesn't hold Iraqi nationality IDs. So that's more or less reflects the Iraq. You know, somebody to have that influence because of his position and because of his ability to father the country. As far as say Muqtada al-Sadr is a religious leader. He has, I think recently was outside the country, went to Lebanon, and now, if I remember correctly, 3 days ago he came back to Iraq. He has declared that he was somewhat unhappy with his own political parties or those who are associated with him, but the lack of focus on the development of the people and more inward focus, as you mentioned earlier in your introduction. So I think in that sense, he is somebody who is aspiring to play a positive role in the development of Iraq. And we are welcoming that for him. As far as the majority government, I think there is maybe sometimes misunderstanding. What we are saying is this current government, the last three governments, has been one in which there is no opposition party. None. No single parliamentarian can say I'm an opposition. Because all the political bloc, all, have had representation at the parliament, have had representation in the government, have had representation at the cabinet level. Cabinet level. So what we have now, where we're saying this might be ineffective and inefficient in the development, primarily because of decision-making process. So what we're driving at is we're saying we need to have representation of all walk of life of Iraq, but it doesn't have to be all in governing. Why can't we have a healthy opposition parties who have a primary role in checks and balance? Bear in mind that the parliamentarians have the authority to legislate and monitor. So that's a key role for them, is they have the authority to monitor the executives. So why should all the Shias have representation at the cabinet? Why should some of them who become opposition, why shouldn't some of the Sunnis or the Kurds or others? So this is where we're coming from. We need to have more policy-oriented than ethnicity-oriented government. That's the key discussion. Nobody is saying there shouldn't be any Sunni in the government. There shouldn't be any Shia. Or the Prime Minister has to be from a certain party or a certain... Nobody's calling for that. And I think we'll have to wait until the election evolves. It's too early to talk about that.
And this one, we're coming near the end here, calls for comment. That this last week in Washington, the Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Louvs, said his view was that economic stability is key to political stability. There are those of us who believe it's the other way around. That political stability is more key to economic stability than the reverse. And examples were given that during the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, the external situation for the 6 GCC countries was unstable, but the domestic situation was very stable, indeed arguably more stable than any other 6 neighboring developing countries. You have a situation here where in the 80s, during the war with Iran, there were more than 50 American company members of the then Iraq U.S. Business Council. The last time I checked, and correct me if I'm wrong, there not even 15 American companies are members of such a council. What's going on?
35.
35, okay, thank you. Great,
I think
that's quite an increase.
I will interject another dimension. The discussion we have in Iraq is, does security come in before political development, or is security a prerequisite for political development, or vice versa, let alone the economic development? So we have a bit more third dimension to think about as well. That's an evolving picture, primarily because we are still not in a mature phase of our political establishment, and certainly we are immature as far as democracy is concerned. We are just started that. It's the first decade of a democratic country in a long road. So in that sense, we appreciate the discussions and the heated discussions sometimes as to where does the development comes in, where does the political, economical, social development comes in, and where does the security comes in. However, you have a regional polarization taking place. That's an issue. You have Syria, a major destabilizing factor in the region, taking place as well. And culturally, the whole region is more politically oriented than economically oriented. That's a cultural narrative. So it's unlike other countries who might be more thinking about prosperity as the only factor. With us, the issue of pride is an important factor, and as I'm sure, Doctor, you know.
Yes, on that, there is the phrase that no one seems to disagree with, that capital is a coward. It does not enter places that are uncertain, unclear, that in places like Azerbaijan and elsewhere in Caucasus and Central Asia, in the early 1990s, this was believed to be another Saudi Arabia. And American oil companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and others invested hundreds of billions, more than $1 billion in those areas. Here we are 24 years later, and it's still not clear, it's certain, enough to satisfy foreign direct investors. So that's just a comment here. But related to that, in terms of the economic aspects, is the Iraqi government working with the Norwegian sovereign wealth funds to develop its own sovereign wealth fund rapidly and strategically? And if not, the Norwegians, are you working on establishing a sovereign wealth fund?
I wish we are, but I don't think we are. I think we are just as, the Minister of Finance was here for his autumn IMF World Bank, and for his spring IMF World Bank, and the governor, we had this type of discussion. We are still need to majorly revamp our financial institutions and to have a clear view of how do we start these development funds, how do we start these international projects of developing Iraq in the financial sector, and how do we best utilize our own revenues from the oil. That's still evolving. I'm not aware we had discussion with the Norwegians, but I think it's a great example to emulate, and it's an inspiring project for us to case study to think about.
Last question. During the heat of the Cold War in the 1950s, President Eisenhower was a leading visionary in establishing a sister cities program that paired American cities with cities in other countries, quite a few of them in the Arab world. Many, many, many more in Israel than the Arab world combined. Maryland has a sister state relationship with Baghdad. Do you have what suggestions do you have for developing such relationships?
We have certain governors who they have been to the United States and tried to work on that. I think the Houston was one, which the governor of Basra tried to work on, and so on. So we're trying to get better understanding of these examples. However, I personally think that the focus has to be on the quality of that relationship and not on the quantities. I know, for example, Basra had something like 5 sisters. I was in Japan, Yokohama, we tried to sister it with Basra as a port. And I think we need to focus on the quality of that relationship, how much lessons we learned in their recycling, environmentals, planning, urban planning, and so on. We're still new at it, I would say. We have good examples to follow, but I don't think we've done enough of our homework to fully utilize that experience.
In bringing this to a close, I neglected to mention in the introductory remarks how Baghdad had been the center of the Islamic world for half of 1,000 years, roughly from 750 to 1250 AD, longer than any other one single capital as such. It was the center of science, of technology, research, development, the arts, the humanities, the social sciences. The world learned a lot from Iraq at that time, and you've helped us to learn a lot